In today's lecture, we will talk about Keynesian perspective on business cycle using aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So let me first give you a historical background about Keynesian perspective. So during the 1930s Great Depression, the economy's capacity to supply goods and services had not changed much. However, US unemployment rate soared higher than 20% from 1933 to 1935. So there was a huge increase in unemployment rate in a very short period of time, despite the fact that nothing changed in terms of economy's capacity to produce goods and services. So John Maynard Keynes, an economist of that time, argued that the economy often produced less than its full employment, not because it was technically impossible to produce more with the existing workers and machines, but because of lack of demand in the economy as a whole led to inadequate incentives for firms to produce. So what John Maynard Keynes was arguing was that economy can end up in a lower than potential GDP. There's no reason that we will be producing at the potential GDP, and we can stop there because of lack of demand for goods and services. So first let me show you who Keynes was. This is the person, John Maynard Keynes, who lived between 1883 and 1946, and perhaps one of the most influential economists of all time. And we are still using his theories to do modern economic policies. So first let's start with aggregate demand in Keynesian analysis. So in the neoclassical world, neoclassical focused on the supply side or aggregate supply, whereas Keynes focused on the demand side of the economy or aggregate demand. And he believed that we can have a situation where demand is low enough that people are not willing to produce. As a result, Keynes argued that firms produce output only if they expect to sell. So demand creates its own supply. That was the argument that Keynes put forward. As a result, Keynes argued that aggregate demand is not stable, that it can change unexpectedly. As a result, it gives rise to recessionary gap. This is a situation when output is below the potential GDP, or it can give rise to an inflationary gap. It is a situation where output is above the potential GDP. Either can happen. So if output is below the potential, it's a recessionary gap. Where if output is above the potential, it's an inflationary gap, because it can cause inflation if output is above the potential GDP. Let me first show you then a Keynesian aggregate demand aggregate supply model, which is slightly different from what we have done in the neoclassical case. In the Keynesian world, your aggregate supply curve is first flat and then it's vertical at the potential GDP. So it's vertical at the potential level, and your aggregate demand is, as usual, it's downward sloping. So Keynesian view of the aggregate demand aggregate supply uses the SRS curve, which is horizontal at levels output below the potential and vertical at the potential output. Thus, when beginning from potential output, any increase in aggregate demand affects only output but not prices. So if your aggregate demand decreases to AD1, see, the effect is only on output Y, and effect is not on prices. However, and if aggregate demand shifts right, which can also happen, so aggregate demand shifted right, the effect is only on prices, no effect on output. So this is your recessionary gap and this is your inflationary gap. Now the question is, why in the Keynesian world this happens? Why Keynes assumes that aggregate supply is flat till potential GDP? And there are a couple of reasons behind it. And here's the building block of Keynesian analysis. The Keynesian view of recession based on two key building blocks. First, we already talked about this, that aggregate demand is not always automatically high enough to provide firms with an incentive to hire enough workers to reach full employment. What if people are not willing to buy goods and services? So firms are not going to hire, they are going to close down. And why people are unwilling to buy? Simply they might feel not comfortable. Maybe they don't have the income. There can be various reasons why aggregate demand is not high enough. Second reason is this: macroeconomy may adjust only slowly to shifts in aggregate demand because of sticky wages and prices. Now this is counter to what you have done before in the neoclassical world, where wages are completely flexible and as well as prices are also flexible. But what Keynes assumed, he assumed sticky. That means it is not flexible. It's kind of like doesn't change. It sticks where it stays. So question is why this is so. So sticky wages and prices is a situation where wages and prices do not fall in response to decrease in demand or do not rise in response to increase in demand. So in a neoclassical world, wages and prices respond to change in demand and supply. But in a Keynesian world, wages and prices are sticky. It does not respond to change in demand immediately. Keynes emphasized one particular reason why wages are sticky. It's called coordination argument. And here's the coordination argument: is that downward wage and price flexibility require perfect information about the level of lower compensation acceptable to our other laborers and market participants. Now, what does it mean? It means that think about a world where you are working, and suppose there's a recession and the market wages are going down. Are you willing to take a lower salary? Of course not, because it is not something in which is normal. So wages we have seen always going up. We barely have seen wages going down. In reality, wages barely decreases. And since wages cannot adjust itself, as a result, we can end up in a situation where output is below potential GDP. So Keynes, in a Keynesian world, a recession can be explained as such. So we know short-run aggregate supply is horizontal and then vertical at the potential GDP, which we also call Y. So let's draw the aggregate demand curve. And aggregate demand can decrease, and let's show it. So if aggregate demand decreases here to AD1, it decreases in AD, this is your new equilibrium Y1. So P star. So a recession begins when aggregate demand declines. So because when aggregate demand declines, your potential Y star decreases to Y1. Now the question is this: why we will stay here in this short run or in this situation? And the reason is this: recession persists because of the assumption of fixed wages and prices, which makes SRAS flat below the potential GDP. Because prices cannot adjust by itself, because of the norms and because of union contract, because of the way actual markets work, and since it cannot adjust, so there's no way we will be able to go back to a long run equilibrium. As a result, we are stuck with a recession which is caused by decrease in aggregate demand. And it was something Keynes focused on, that the major reason for recessions are decrease in aggregate demand. Now the question is, what are the policy implications? Because Keynesian economics has a lot of policy implications, and one of the policy implications is that we need to increase aggregate demand to the full employment level. Question is, how do you increase aggregate demand? For that, we need to start talking about policies.